What is up, guys? Welcome back to Life on the Wrist. This is going to be Learning About Vintage Watches episode 3. We're going to be talking about what is important to collectors when it comes to watches. We've created 2 other episodes previously. The first one we kind of talked about the anatomy of a watch, so you kind of understand how to describe a watch. The second episode, we actually went a little bit more specific on one specific type of watch that's extremely well known and desired by a lot of collectors, and that is the Rolex Daytona. And today, like I said, we're going to be discussing what is important to collectors when it comes to buying watches. But before we get into that, if you are new to the channel and this is the first time you're hearing it, be sure to smash that like button. For us, it really does help us out. You guys have shown a lot of support for our channel, and we started off the year really nicely, so be sure to do that. Also, while you're by that like button, be sure to hit the subscribe button if you like videos about watches. So be sure to do that. So getting into the topic, kind of going into what is important to collectors when they're buying watches, there's a lot of factors when it comes to vintage watches that collectors are going to be considering, and there's a lot of work that they do beforehand before they kind of decide on which watch they're going to end up purchasing. But I kind of want to outline a couple of things that are extremely important to a collector, some things that I find important and that other people have asked about when I'm dealing with some very serious collectors. So the first thing is the condition of the watch. So condition is actually a very subjective kind of characteristic of a watch. A lot of people, there's kind of different camps that you can kind of fall into when it comes to what type of condition you want to buy when you're kind of creating your collection of vintage watches. So there's one side of condition where the collector really wants a watch that's in like new condition. I'm thinking about collectors like Jean-Claude Biver. If you look at his talking watches, his watches are in just about untouched condition. He says that he doesn't want anything to have been polished or buffed or redone, and that's kind of, I think, one way of looking at condition and how a lot of collectors want. They want to make sure that the dial of the watch is not being refinished. It has a natural patina that hasn't been touched by any type of watchmaker. They want to make sure that the movement of the watch hasn't been replaced and aren't replacement parts from perhaps a third-party watchmaker. It's all coming from the manufacturer. So that's one way of looking at condition. The other way of looking at condition is a collector who actually wants to see the age and the adventures that the watch has been on. That means, like, the perfect example that I think of is a Rolex Submariner that perhaps, has some scratches on the glass, and the dial has been aged and perhaps has reacted with salt water if water ended up getting into it. That type of thing, some collectors find that extremely appealing, and that's the type of condition that they want to purchase. So as a collector, as a vintage watch collector, if you are on the buying side of things, you should probably identify what type of condition do you like. Do you like untouched, all original, like it was when it was first manufactured? Or do you like to see the age of the watch a little bit? Or do you fall somewhere in between? I know a lot of collectors who like watches that are in relatively good condition, but they show a little bit of age. They have a nice patina to the dial. That's another type of collecting when it comes to condition. So identifying where you kind of fall in on the spectrum is a very important part when you're on the buying side. It also, you'll probably notice that your collection may vary, or perhaps it will be the same across all sides, that you want the same level of condition across all of your watches. So that's something you should identify on the buying side. On the selling side, you probably want to make sure that you're selling to a collector. You probably want to gauge the person who is going to potentially be buying your watch and understand what they like in the condition of their watches. Because the worst thing that could happen is you think that they want something that is showing a little bit of age, has a little bit of a natural patina, perhaps a little bit more of an adventure patina, and then they receive it and they say, I wanted this to be in untouched condition. So that's a very important distinction that you need to make sure that you identify in the person who may be potentially purchasing your watch. Also, if you are communicating with that individual, make sure to be as transparent as possible when it comes to the condition of your individual piece. A nice example is this memo sale. So this is kind of the patina that I like. This is a gold-plated case. Some of the gold plating is coming off on the sides of the case, but that's not what is important. That type of patina is totally fine with me. So that's kind of how one should approach condition when it comes to vintage watches and how collectors kind of look at it. The next area that we want to focus on is what comes with the watch. This can be everything from the strap that is attached to the watch. Is it the original strap? Is it a replacement strap? Is it a replacement bracelet? But it also can go to the things like the original box that it was purchased in, the original purchase receipts, the guarantee from the manufacturer, the instruction manuals. Those types of things are an important part to collect. It's an important part of purchasing a vintage watch to collectors. Now, I know a lot of the times people think that this adds tremendous value to the watch. I would say it adds marginal value to the watch. If a watch ends up having the original bracelet, the original box, original papers, it adds marginal value to the watch when it comes to selling that piece. But I don't think it's as heavily. It doesn't add so much value as many people believe it is. It is very important, and I think people like that because it kind of completes their idea of what this watch is. So, you know, if it has all these original pieces, original papers, original box, original bracelet, that's kind of a sign of like, okay, the individual who owned this watch probably took care of it and made sure that they kept all of the ingredients that were kind of sold with this watch together, and it just adds a little bit more of care and time that probably went into maintaining this watch. I think another part of this kind of idea is if there was any servicing done to the watch, keeping a hold of the papers that kind of describe what has happened to this watch is extremely important. Because as a collector, let's say from the buying side, you probably want to know what has been done to this watch as it's kind of passed hands or has kind of gone through its kind of life of you know, services that are kind of inevitable when it comes to mechanical watches. So service papers are extremely important from a buying side. Also from a selling side, I think people end up trusting you as a buyer, or you as a seller, excuse me, if you're able to kind of trace what has been done to this watch. It also is a good earmark for what the condition of the watch is, which, like I said previously, is one of the factors that collectors find extremely important when it comes to buying watches. So box and papers are add marginal value to the watch, but it's also an important part to collectors because it allows them to kind of have the whole package as opposed to purchasing kind of a partial package. And lastly, and I think this is the most important thing, and it's become probably, I think, one of the the most important things when it comes to collecting vintage watches, and that's the history of the watch that you'll be purchasing or selling. So as vintage watches have kind of come into their own and kind of become an extremely big part of watch collecting, people are there's a lot of watches that have kind of been faked or kind of shoved together, perhaps a movement from one combined with a case of another. Dials have been refinished poorly, I would say, because there are some that have been refinished and it's been okay, but haven't been sent back to the manufacturer. So as vintage watches become more popular, they change hands a lot more. People want to get their hands on just anything, and then they try to, bring it up to speed onto the way in which they would want to look at. Perhaps it's of lesser condition, so they try to bring it up to the condition that they would want. So because of that, I think the history of the individual watch has become extremely important to collectors. I think collectors are a lot more inclined to buy watches that have been owned by a single owner as opposed to have changed hands very often. So they rather purchase a watch from the original owner or perhaps the second owner of the watch. And I think that's become a lot more important to collectors. They don't like watches that it's hard to trace hands. They don't like when someone else doesn't have a lot of information on the history of the watch. And at Life on the Wrist, we try to source watches where we can identify that history and pass that along to the collector who's looking to purchase that piece, because that we've identified that as being the most important thing to collectors. I think if you are on the buying side of that, I think being able to see the story of the watch is an extremely important part, because it allows you to kind of have confidence in the piece. If it comes with box and papers, you can actually trace that history. Also, a lot of the times it'll be in the condition that you probably want, because you'll be attracted by kind of the stories of where that watch has been. So let's say it was a dive watch that was used and kind of is beaten up, it will be with the original diver who used it and could tell you a lot more stories about it. Also, if it was kind of like a safe queen, all original condition, that individual can kind of be a testament to the fact that it was just sitting in their safe, etc., etc. So that's from the buying side. From the selling side, you want to make sure that you have those stories in order to give to the next owner. I think just from a practical sense, it's a nice way of saying, yeah, I own this watch. It's very transparent. If you have documentation or pictures or something that can kind of be as transparent as possible to that buyer about where that watch has been, how it was taken care of, that you were the original owner of it, that's what's very important to collectors. So from the selling side, have those pieces of traceability that can be used to kind of show a potential buyer. So those are the most important things that are, in my opinion, the most important things that a vintage watch collector thinks about when buying or selling a watch. I think this is a very important part of learning about vintage watches, identifying watches that are in the condition that you want, identifying if they have the box or papers that can show traceability of the history, which is ultimately the most important part of collecting vintage watches. That's kind of what's most important. If you have a topic that you think would be helpful for episode 4 for those who are kind of learning about vintage watches, be sure to put it in the comment section below. And if you've made it this far and you haven't already, be sure to hit that like button. It really does help us out. Also, if you are new to the channel, we create videos about watches, so be sure to hit the subscribe button. And with that said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time.